Our theme this week, as Richard suggested, is there a reason why we believe or why we do the things we do? And that comes, of course, from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet with meekness and fear. And so tonight we bring the series of lessons to a close as we think about, is there a reason why we believe that God created the world? Now, I have to forewarn you, this is going to be the longest of all of the lessons because I got a lot I need to say about this. Reminds me of the old country preacher that was greeting the folks as they were leaving the country church house, and several of them said to him, "That's a good sermon, preacher." And he said, "Well, I knew it was a good sermon when I got on my second pitcher of water." I don't have any water up here, but it is going to be a lengthy sermon, but I hope it'll be profitable. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Genesis 1, verse 1. Not that many years ago, just about everyone we would have encountered on a day-to-day basis would have believed that statement. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And they would also have had at least a passing knowledge of the Scriptures, a passing knowledge of the Bible. They would have known who Moses was, who Jonah was. They would have known many of the facts of the Bible, some of the parables and some of the teachings. But that time has gone. Unfortunately, right here in this very community, we would not have to go very far to find people who've probably never heard those words. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Would have no idea whatsoever who Moses was or who Isaiah was or any of the prophets, much less know anything about Jesus. Militant atheism, as Richard has suggested, is on the rise. Media moguls, college professors, and even some high school teachers, some scientists and other skeptics seem to see it as their purpose to drive God completely out of the public realm, and certainly to drive him out of the educational institutions of our land. And they feel it is their destiny to rid the world of faith in God. And it seems that our youth are the favorite target. Is there a reason or reasons that we can give as to why we believe that God created the world? Well, yes, there are. I want to begin with a couple of basic concepts, however, that we can all agree on, out of which or upon which we will build some of these reasons or some of the arguments for the fact that God exists and that he did create the world. First, something exists. Now, we're not like the whatever philosopher it was that once said, "I think, therefore I am." I don't think any of us doubt our own existence. We don't doubt that something exists. There's something here. This pulpit is here. I can feel it. You can see it. We could pick it up and realize it has mass. It has volume. It's real. It's here. It is a real thing. We all acknowledge that something exists. We also recognize that you cannot get something from nothing. Now, it's an virtual impossibility, but suppose I had a bucket of nothing up here and ask you to come up here and reach into that bucket and tell me what you pull out. You would pull out nothing, because if you have nothing to start with, you can't get something. So we recognize that that something exists. And if it is the case that there was ever a time that nothing existed, then that's what would exist today. But we know that something does exist. The universe exists. We exist. We can look at the stars. We see the sun. We see life all around us. We know that this exists. And so we cannot deny that something exists. Now, how did it get here? That's the question. Secondly, not only does something exist, we need to appreciate the difference between a law and a theory, a law of science and a theory. A law of science is something that is demonstrable. It's also, by the way, falsifiable. That's one of the ways that you prove a law of science is a law, that it can be falsified. But a law of science is applicable everywhere and in every time, and it's demonstrable. If a law of science applies and an experiment is conducted, according to the laws of science, the result of that experiment will be the same every time. And there are many of these laws of science. Theories, however, and the theory of evolution is just that. Don't let anybody ever tell you it's otherwise, because it's not demonstrable and it's not falsifiable. But be that as it may, a theory is simply one's conjecture based upon some or maybe even a lot of evidence as to how things are and how they act. And so the theory of evolution is simply a conjecture as to how the things that exist, particularly life, got here. And it's not a law, it's a theory. And it has never been proven. Regardless of what some scientists want to claim, evolution is not a fact. Let me just throw this out here. There's a lot of resources. Got a couple of younger folks here that probably much more technologically astute than I am. But there is a world of resources on the internet. There are two websites that I would call to your attention, both of which are run by our brethren. One is called Apologetics Press, and it is run by Apologetics Press out of Montgomery, Alabama. The other is Focus Press, which is run by Brother Brad Harrop and others in Nashville, Tennessee. And you can go online, and particularly with Apologetics Press, they have just a mountain of information, DVDs that can be purchased for young people. And I'm talking young people, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th graders. And that's where we need to start inculcating in these young people the principles of biblical creation and so forth and so on. But these resources are there. And I would encourage you to check that out. Incidentally, along that line, you can do a search for dissent from Darwinism. Many scientists will say, well, every scientist believes in evolution. And if you don't believe in evolution, you're just ignorant. Well, there's a website called Dissent from Darwinism, or Dissent from Darwin, maybe. I should have checked it out before I came tonight. But Dissent from Darwin is a place where people with a respected, recognized doctor's degree or greater in a science can go and sign an online petition that says, we do not accept the theory of evolution and think it needs much more critical scientific examination. Now, don't misunderstand. The people that sign that may or may not be theists. They may or may not believe in God. But the point is, there are last time I looked, there are over 1,000 from all over the world, scientists, that have signed that petition. There are many books out there as well that are critical of Darwinian evolution. So there is a difference between a law of science and a theory, and the theory of evolution is not universally accepted. But number 3, something exists. There's a difference between a law and a theory, and one of those laws that's very critical to our lesson tonight is the law of cause and effect. This law has been around a long, long time. I'm not quite sure who it was. It may have been Newton's laws of motion or Newton's laws of physics, whatever. But the principle is, for every cause, or every effect rather, there has to be a cause. This is an accepted standard. This is an accepted scientific law that guides all scientific and legal inquiry. Now, that cause must be a necessary and sufficient cause. What do we mean by that, a necessary and sufficient cause? Well, we might be standing out here on the porch of the church house on a Sunday afternoon in June or July, and the wind is blowing at about 25 miles an hour, and we see a butterfly flap by. Now, that butterfly flapping by is not a necessary and sufficient cause for a 25 mile per hour wind. That's not a necessary and sufficient cause. And for one to try to say that butterfly is what's causing these winds, we recognize that is falsified by the law of cause and effect. You may have read or may have seen the movie based upon the book by Daniel Defoe called Robinson Crusoe. You remember that Robinson Crusoe was shipwrecked on a desert island. And at one point in time, he comes to know that there's another human being on the island. You remember how that happened? He's walking along the beach and he saw a human footprint. You see, and he reasoned from that. He reasoned from that there must be another human individual on the island, because the only thing that is a necessary and sufficient cause for a human footprint in the sand is a human. And so he reasoned correctly that there was another human on the island. He found that human, taught him how to speak English, and called him Friday. We often use and depend upon this principle of cause and effect in our everyday life. And I'll leave it up to you to look for examples in your life of the principle of the law of cause and effect. Now that brings me to our first reason why we believe that God created the world, and that is the argument from cause and effect. Recognizing the truth of that law, we reason this way: the universe exists. It is the effect. Now, what is the cause? What is the necessary and sufficient cause for what exists? For all the stars, all the things that we see, the trees, the flowers, the rocks, the earth, the water, oxygen, what is the necessary and sufficient cause for what we see? Well, there have been three options proposed in answer to that question. One is that the universe is eternal. That is, it's always existed. We're going to see in just a moment that that's not the case. Even the scientists recognize that that's not the case. Secondly, that the physical universe, through some means, created itself. Now, it's interesting to me that many scientists claim, well, the universe began with this Big Bang. And you ask them, well, what material was in the Big Bang? And they'll tell you, well, all of matter and energy was reduced down to a little dot, not much bigger than a period at the end of a sentence. And then something happened, and it exploded, and there's the universe. The universe created itself. A third possibility is that the universe was created by a cause greater than itself. Now, all agree, as I suggested a moment or two ago, that the universe is not eternal. It had a beginning. And an honest scientist will agree and will not argue otherwise that matter cannot create itself. Now, there's a law and this may mean nothing to you, and if that's the case, ignore it, but the second law of thermodynamics. And when I was in engineering school at Tennessee Tech, we studied these laws of thermodynamics. And I remember the second law of thermodynamics, which says that in a closed system, and our universe is a closed system, in a closed system, all things tend toward maximum entropy. The word entropy simply means disorder, meaning that in a closed system, if a thing is left alone, left to itself, it will eventually decay and eventually become so disordered as to collapse, if you will. Now, the reality is that's what's happening to our universe. Our universe is running down, and one of these days it will stop. Many scientists speculate on, well, when will the sun burn out? Well, that's an admission that the second law of thermodynamics is in effect, because eventually the sun's going to burn out, and this old world is going to freeze and approach absolute zero, and all motion will stop. Scientists recognize that the universe had a beginning, and the universe will have an end. You remember some years ago when NASA launched this Hubble Space Telescope? You know what that was all about? You know what billions of your tax dollars were spent? You know why that thing's up there? And you remember also that the first time they tried it, they said, uh-oh, this thing ain't working right. And we had to spend some more billions of dollars to basically put a set of eyeglasses on it. But the reason they put the Hubble telescope up there is they're searching for the edge of the universe. Well, why would they want to know where the edge of the universe is? Because they know that the universe is expanding. They know the rate at which it is expanding. Now, Richard was an engineer, and he can tell you whatever formula it is. I'm sure I once knew, but long since forgotten. If you know how fast a thing is moving and how far it has moved, then you can tell when it started moving. If you know how fast it's moving and even how fast it's accelerating, and you know how far it's moved, then you can figure out when it started moving. And so they're looking for the edge of the universe. And if they can find the edge of the universe, they know how fast it's moving and how fast it's expanding, then it's a simple matter of plugging in the right figures in the formula, and they can figure when the universe began, when the Big Bang took place. And that's what we spent billions of dollars to find out. But you see, that establishes the fact that even the scientists believe that the universe had a beginning and will have an end. So matter is not eternal. So the universe didn't create itself. The universe is not eternal. The only one of our three options left is the universe was created by a cause greater than itself. What could or who could create this universe? What cause is greater than what exists? What is the only necessary and sufficient cause for what we see? Well, if it isn't eternal, if matter is not eternal, then it must be mind. That's the only two options, matter or mind. And mind then, God, the eternal cause, the eternal first cause, is the only possible answer, the only necessary and sufficient cause for what we see. And so the statement that God exists and that He created the world is consistent with the law of cause and effect. Only God is the necessary and sufficient cause for what we see. The second reason that we can give is the argument from design, or the teleological argument. The first one we just talked about, the law of cause and effect, is often called the cosmological argument for the existence of God and what we see. I want to suggest to you that the argument from design, or the teleological argument, is another reason why we believe that God created the world. If we were walking along the base of a mountain or a base of a big hill, say up here on Highway 12, many of you make that trip to Nashville on a regular basis, and you go through one of these cuts where they cut out all of the rock, and if you look over there one day and there's rocks laying down at in just a random pile along the base of that cut where they've cut that, and maybe some out on the highway, you would look and you would say, oh, landslide. You wouldn't think anything about it. But now, if you were driving along and you saw rocks that were not in a random, disorderly pile, but rather were in an orderly fashion, say like Stonehenge, you would then think some intelligence has acted on these rocks. Now, you know that pile of rocks at the base of the cut on Highway 12, where they're all just piled up there randomly. You know that no intelligence has acted on that. Gravity acted on it, yes. But compare that to Stonehenge, and you will say, some intelligence, somebody put that there. That didn't just happen. Now, suppose we're walking along through the forest and we come upon a log cabin. We would think, We looked around and we saw some trees that have fallen over. And we would recognize, well, that's just what happens. But then we see these trees trimmed out and placed one on top of the other and put into the form of a cabin, and we say, some intelligence has acted on those trees. Those trees, just like those rocks at Stonehenge, did not put themselves in that order. Some intelligence had to act on those trees. It has design. It has order. And that design and that order tells us that some intelligence that understands design and order acted upon those trees. Maybe something a little more contemporary. I'm tickled at the fact that Richard and Jeff during this meeting have been playing with that little iPad and controlling the PA system with the iPad and all that kind of thing. Suppose you were walking along the beach and you saw a computer laying on the beach, because a computer is basically sand. That's what most of the components of a computer are. They're silicon. Silicon Valley, where all the components are made. They're made out of sand. Now suppose you walk along the beach and you see a computer there. You would think, oh, well, that just happened. Light, wind, time, sunshine, whatever, acted upon the sand on the beach, and there's the computer. No, we would never think that. We would think some intelligence is behind that device that's laying. We might, think about 500 years from now, and somebody walks through and find, they may not know what it is, they may not know what it did, but they would never reason that it just happened. Even if they broke down the constituent elements of the things, that, well, this is amazing. We found this thing in the sand, and it's basically made out of sand. No, they would not reason that it just happened. They would say some intelligence made this. So, which would be more reasonable, to believe that some intelligence was behind what obviously has design and order, or to believe that which has design came about by chance and time, literally by accident? It would be more reasonable to believe that someone, an intelligence, put those things there. That Stonehenge, that cabin in the woods, that computer on the beach. To say it another way, design demands a designer. The universe does indeed evidence order and design. Let's think about that for just a moment. The universe evidences order and design in the vastness of interstellar space. One of my favorite movies, and I've watched it a number of times, a Tom Hanks movie, Apollo 13. You may have seen that movie. Some of us remember when the first moon landing, and Neil Armstrong stepped out, and we saw that grainy image of that one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And we were absolutely amazed. How could they do that? How could they send a man to the moon? Well, let's think about that a minute. When they launched that rocket from Cape Canaveral and it started across that 250,000 miles of empty space, they didn't aim that rocket at the moon. Because if they aimed it at the moon, when it traversed those 250,000 miles, the moon would be gone. And so they aimed that rocket at where the moon was going to be, every how many hours from the time that it left Earth orbit till the time it got to the moon, so that the moon and the rocket would come together. Well, now, how were they able to do that? Because for as long as man has been able to observe, that moon moves across the same arc, the same way, day after day, month after month, year after year. It has order. And they were able to shoot that rocket at where it's going to be, ever how many days it was, 4 days later, and lo and behold, there it was. How is it that they can shoot a rocket further? And by the way, I don't know if you've noticed or aware of this, but it was sometime last year, maybe the year before, the first man-made object actually left our solar system and moved into interstellar space. It was launched like 20 years ago. It took 20 years for it to get out of our solar system, traveling at some 25,000 miles an hour. But the point being is, as it left our solar system, it flew by about 5 planets. How did they know how to do that? Because there's order even in interstellar space. We have been splitting the atom and fusing the atom for some 60, 70 years now. How can we do that? Because there is order even on the subatomic level. We know that if you take that little mass of radioactive material and you bombard it properly with the proper electrons and all that kind of stuff, it'll either fuse together or it will split, and when it does, it's going to create a self-sustaining chain reaction, that's going to generate a great deal of energy. And we use that today to generate electricity. So there's order and there's design in the world, even from the interstellar space to the very minute particles that we're aware of in this world. And so we recognize that there is design. Think for just a moment or two about your body and the way that your body is designed. One of the marvels of creation is the eye. And I heard an atheist say, you theists need to quit using the eye as an example, because the eye actually takes the light in and records it upside down. How efficient is that? And I was listening to it on a CD, and I wanted to reach in there and tell him, yeah, but you see, God compensated for that because our brain turns the image right side up. You can take a magnifying glass and hold up a piece of paper and put the magnifying glass between a lamp and that piece of paper and get it focused, and the lamp's upside down. Because when it comes through the lens, it refracts it, turns it upside down. And our eye does the same thing. But our brain turns it right side up. What a marvel of creation. What a marvel of design. And our bodies are are designed in such a way as to be ideally suited for existence in this old world. One of the evidences of intelligence and information, by the way, is communication. Maybe you've seen pictures of these huge, like satellite dishes. I mean huge, a quarter of a mile across, and this array of these satellite dishes out in the desert, Southwest desert. And we built that with our tax dollars, and they've been aimed out into space for many years, and they were listening for communication from interstellar space. The government finally gave up on it, decided we weren't going to hear anything, and they sold it probably for about 0.5 cent on the dollar to some private group that's now doing the same thing, but they have not heard anything but static. But I find it a curiosity that they continue to look for information and communication which would argue to them that there's life out there. Now, think about that for just a moment. If information and communication is an evidence of intelligence and design, and that's what they would say if they ever heard something, that means there's life out there, there's intelligence out there. Think of how much information is in a kernel of corn. Ever think about that? You drop that kernel of corn, and many of you probably have gardens, a kernel of corn or a bean or a tomato seed or whatever. You ever thought about, and you do not have to place that kernel of corn in the ground right side up, whatever that happens to be. Because when it sprouts, somehow it knows to send the stem up and the roots down. How does it know to do that? How do the trees know that when it starts getting cold to drop the leaves? And how do the trees know when it starts getting warm to bud, put forth flowers, which turns into fruit or nuts or whatever that contain the seed to start the whole process over again? Because in the seed, Genesis chapter 1, is the information for life. And then in every cell in your body, the DNA has enough information, has so much information that it actually took scientists some 60 years to decipher it. And when the man broke the code of the DNA and came up with that helix, double helix, and decoded the human genome, when he did that, he made this statement: I have found God. And what he meant by that was there's nothing in this world that explains DNA other than that intelligence created it. So two reasons why we believe God created the world: the law of cause and effect, or the cosmological argument, and the argument from design, or the teleological argument. Interestingly enough, The Bible uses these same arguments. Turn in your Bible to Psalm 8, verses 1 through 5. Psalm 8, 1 through 5. David argues this same idea in Psalm 8, verses 1 through 5. And David, being a shepherd, spent many nights out in the field, I'm sure gazing at the heavens. He said, Lord, O our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants you have ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, even the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the sea. David said, when I look at the universe, I see the hand of God. Nothing can explain it but the hand of God. In his sermon on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul again uses the same reasoning. When he meets with these philosophers and the intelligentsia and the aristocracy of Athens, the center of learning in the ancient Greek world, and begins to talk to them and reason with them, where does he begin? He begins with the unknown God, but notice what he tells these people about this unknown God, meaning the one that they didn't know about, the one that they made a monument to just in case they missed one. He says in verse 23, as I was passing through and considering the object of your worship, I even found an altar with the inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing him, I proclaim to you, God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth and does not dwell in temples made with hand, and goes on to argue that this God is not like the heathen gods made of metal and stone or wood. He argues from the same thing we're talking about here. What you see cannot be the result of anything but the creative hand of an intelligence, a sufficient and necessary cause. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 8, the Apostle Paul, in the first chapter of the book of Romans, argues the same thing. When he says in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them since the creation of the world. His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they're without excuse. He says, look, you Romans ought to be able to look around and see what exists and realize that there's something beyond yourselves and beyond the gods that you worship. And so it is a legitimate procedure, as we've done this evening, and we're going to do some more of it. Don't think we're through now. I told you it's going to be a longer sermon. It is a legitimate procedure then to reason from the things that we see back to the cause, which is the eternal God. Let us then turn now to some other reasons. We've given reasons that are outside of ourselves. The reason of cause and effect, the reason of design demands a designer, the cosmological, teleological arguments. Let's now turn to some arguments that may be a little more familiar, because these are what are called anthropological arguments. That is, they come from or based upon man's nature and man's undeniable characteristics. These are things you know about yourself that you cannot deny, and these reasons also rely upon the principle of cause and effect. One of these reasons is what's called the moral argument. And to me, I find this one of the most compelling arguments for the existence of God, who then created the world. It's based upon the universal need for morality and the universal existence of a sense of morality. Let me see if I can explain this. There is in every human being a sense of ought, a sense of fair play, a sense of right and wrong. Now, we may disagree about what is right or wrong, but there is an innate sense of fair play, of rightness and wrongness. And it is universal. There's never been a culture discovered or unearthed, no matter how primitive it may be according to our standards, that did not have this sense of morality, this sense of oughtness, this sense of right and wrong. Let me share with you another resource. You can go down to Barnes & Noble or any bookstore, find it online. A fellow by the name of C.S. Lewis, who was a British fellow, who was an avowed atheist, and he began to think about this, and eventually he converted himself to theism and then to a particular brand of Christianity. He wrote a book. He became a preacher. And he preached a series of sermons on the radio, and he took those sermons and transcribed them and put them in book form. And the book is called Mere Christianity. Excellent book, highly recommend it. Written very much on the popular level, easy to understand. But in that book, Mr. Lewis illustrated the sense of morality by suggesting that only human beings can quarrel and argue. He suggested that if you listen to two people, even children, quarreling, at some point one of them is going to say, that's not fair. That's not fair. Or you shouldn't do that. Or you ought to do this. And in so doing, even children, they then are appealing to something that exists beyond themselves, this innate concept that there is something that's right and something that's wrong. Now, we may disagree on the actual activity that's right or wrong, but we agree in the principle there is a right and there is a wrong, this sense of oughtness, this sense of morality. And these two antagonists, whether they be children or grown people or whatever, when they appeal to this sense of right or wrong, they are appealing to this universal sense of ought, this universal sense of morality that all men have, even if they differ on what they believe to be right and wrong. And by the way, even the hardened criminals have that sense. I had the opportunity a couple of times to tour Alcatraz. And some of you remember the Rock out there in San Francisco Bay. One of the times that I was there, I found there was a guy there who had been an inmate at Alcatraz, and he wrote his story. And the story is The Last Train to Alcatraz. And I bought that book, and he signed it, and we chatted a while. And then reading that book, he argued, and he pointed out that even among the hardened criminals, even among the most detestable of the dregs of society, there was a sense of that you ought not to do certain things. One is steal from your cellmates or your fellow inmates. Now here's a guy in there for grand theft, larceny, and bank robbery and every other thing, but he learned real quick you don't steal from your fellow inmates. You ought not do that. Well, criminals, what difference does it make? Another example from C.S. Lewis, and I really love this one. Suppose you're walking along out here on your farm or somebody else's farm, and you hear a man splashing around and flailing away and crying for help, and you look around and there's a pond or a lake there, and there's this guy out in the middle of the lake, and he's flailing around, and it's obvious he's about to drown. When you see that, an impulse comes into your mind in some order or another. Well, the knucklehead got himself in that situation, let him drown. And then there's a second possible impulse. We could help him and save him. And then a third impulse will come. What ought I to do? What ought I to do? What's the moral thing to do? Whence comes that sense of morality? And understanding that innate sense of morality also explains the innate sense of guilt we all have. That feeling that comes over us because our conscience tells us you have messed up. You did something you ought not to have done, and you begin to feel guilty. Where does that come from? The only possible explanation for that is a moral God put that impulse in us. This sense of ought will often motivate a man to do the very thing that's contrary to his best interest. Back on the edge of the pond or the lake, and the guy's out there drowning. What ought I to do? Well, I ought to help the guy, and so I will put myself in jeopardy, contrary to my best interest, contrary to the notion of the survival of the fittest, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to try to help the guy. I may drown in doing so, and I probably would because I can't swim. But what ought I to do? And I will put my own best interests aside and try to help the man, try to save the man. And probably if I don't, knowing that I could have, I would feel guilty about it the rest of my life. Whence cometh those kinds of impulses? Because it is universal in every culture, no matter how primitive. And as I suggested, it is there even among those we would find otherwise morally deficient, such as thieves and murderers. Where did this come from? Animals don't have it. Let's go back to the lake again. Because as we've been walking around the farm, we've noticed all around this lake are cows, maybe a few goats and sheep. Now, when they hear this human being over there flailing away and yelling for help, and there's this cow over here and she's got her head down and she's eating grass, she may look up and see what the noise is all about, and then you know what she's going to do? She's going to go right back to eating that grass. Because she has no compulsion, no sense of morality whatsoever. Even if it was a fellow cow. Now, the maternal instinct may kick in if it was her calf, but I'll guarantee you she will never go into that water to get the calf. She'll stand on the safe ground and moo. Because they do not have this sense of, animals don't have it. Another illustration, if I can, several years ago when Mary and I both worked in downtown Nashville, and we lived out south of Nashville, and I'll never forget this. We were going down Nolan's Road, and we were caught by the red light right at Nolan's Road and Glen Rose Avenue. But the car in front of us made it through the light, and we saw this pack of dogs, there were about 5 of them, run out in front of that car, and that person hit their brakes, but got the last dog. Killed it. Right there in the middle of the road. You know what the other 4 dogs did? One of them got up and started holding back the traffic and directing the traffic around. The other one called Doggy 911, got the ambulance, and no. They turned around and looked. Went on. Because animals do not have this sense of morality. We cannot explain that apart from God's existence. We cannot explain that apart from the fact that God placed that in. In fact, Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11, the Bible tells us that He, God, has put eternity in our hearts. And what about the universal religious impulse of man? Never has a culture been unearthed, no matter how ancient or how remote, that did not worship something. Now, they may have worshiped a mountain, they may have worshiped trees, they may have worshiped the ocean, or they may have been like our society and worship money or power or something else, but they worshiped something. Where did this universal urge to worship come from? He has put eternity in their hearts. Well, quickly, a couple of more. How can naturalistic forces explain emotions? Animals cannot and do not emote as we do. I'm going to say something here. I get in trouble every time I say it because somebody always argues with me after the lesson's over with. But animals cannot emote as do humans. For example, animals cannot love as humans do. Somebody says, oh, wait a minute, preacher, my doggy loves me. No, your doggy has been trained When you come in and your doggy begins to wag his tail, he knows that you're going to pet him and you're going to be nice to him and you're going to feed him and you're going to keep him warm. And that's a trained affection. That's not love. Because you can start kicking that dog in the teeth every time you see him, and within a week or two, when you come in, he will not wag his tail. He will bare his teeth at you. Contrast that to the emotions that a human being is able to have. Here's a mother of a son who is just a no good, low down rascal. He has mistreated her. He has mistreated his siblings. He's in prison and out of prison. He's just a low down, good for nothing rascal. But you know what? Mama will continue to love him until the day she dies. Where does that come from? From a God that loves us, even though we're unlovable. You cannot explain those kinds of emotions apart from an eternal, loving God. How do you explain such concepts as mercy and forgiveness and even justice apart from a God who has those qualities? If evolution is true and it's the survival of the fittest, there would be no mercy, there would be no justice, there would be no forgiveness. You know, when you get a guy down, kick him and keep him down. But no, the Christian impulse, the religious impulse is you extend mercy, you extend forgiveness, or you at least seek justice. Finally, how can naturalistic forces explain the ability that we have to reason in the abstract? I remember the very first time that a teacher wrote up on the board 2x plus 3 equals 9. And she said, now what is x? And I said, well, you tell me and we'll figure it out. You see, when we're young, we can't comprehend that abstract notion of x. And that's the reason we don't teach kindergartners algebra, because it's full of abstract concepts. We wait until their mind matures so that they can reason in the abstract, and then we teach them algebra and chemistry and all of these things that necessitate reasoning beyond the physical existence right here. Human beings are the only creatures in all of nature that can reason in the abstract. Have you ever thought about what life's going to be when you're dead and gone? And don't tell me I'm the only one that's ever done that. Cows don't do that. Dogs don't do that. No animal does that. But we do it. We think about what life was like before we got here. That's why we study history. That's why we enjoy films and documentaries and things that tell us about things that happened in the past, because we can think about that. I watched the other day a documentary, the day Kennedy died. And in that documentary, they talked about all the speculative conspiracy theories. This is the ability to reason in the abstract. Animals don't have that. Where did that come from? Only man can ponder such questions as his own existence, his origin, his destiny. Only man can contemplate what was before him, what will come after him, and what will be beyond this world. And again, where do these qualities come from? The answer is in one verse. Genesis 1 and verse 27. Let us make man in our image. Let us make man in our image. We have that spark of the divine that gives us the ability to emote, to reason, and to think, and to contemplate about religion, about morality, about all of these things. And in that we are unique in all of creation. You are not here, and I am not here, as a result of pure chance and time. We're not here as a result of a big bang gone wild, guided by some unknown process, mindless process that brought all things into existence. But we are here as the result of a creative act of a benevolent, loving God. A God who wishes to have relationship with you. A God who has made that possible through the salvation that's offered through what Jesus did on the cross. If you've not accepted that offer and you need to obey the gospel tonight, we'd be delighted to assist you with that. If you're a Christian who has lost that relationship and you need to come back and claim it again, that opportunity is yours. If you need to respond to the invitation tonight, won't you come as we stand together and sing?